Good morning. This morning I want to continue on with my video on religion and violence. If you remember in part 1 I said that the original sin was eating from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and it's that dividing the world into good and bad groups that is the source of a lot of the hatred and violence in our world today. I looked at some of the ways this is done in history. We've divided the world into capitalist, communist, white, black, man, woman, Christian, non-Christian, Christian, Muslim, saint, sinner. The list goes on, and it's this dividing the world and judging the world that creates victims, that leads to hatred, and ultimately leads to violence. What I want to do in this video is look at how this was played out in the Gospels, and I see this as one of the major themes in the Gospels. You just need to look for it. Society at the time of Jesus was divided into clearly defined groups who were considered acceptable and pleasing to God, and groups who were considered unacceptable and not pleasing to God. The groups who were considered acceptable to God were Jewish people who obeyed the Torah, the good, law-abiding citizens. The people who were considered unacceptable to God were people like the Gentiles. Gentiles was anybody who wasn't a Jew was a Gentile. The Jews believed that they were the chosen race, and so everyone else was unchosen. For example, the Roman occupiers at the time of Jesus. Another group considered unacceptable to God were the Samaritans. Samaritans were a racially mixed group. They were a mixture of Judaism and paganism. They worshipped on Mount Gerizim, not in Jerusalem. So the Samaritans were avoided at all costs by the Jews. Tax collectors were seen as, they were Jewish people who were seen as traitors because they worked for the Roman oppressors. Sinners, anybody who couldn't obey the law or keep the law, for example, adulterers, someone who worked on the Sabbath, someone who didn't clean themselves properly before they ate, they were all considered sinners and therefore unacceptable to God. The sick and the poor, sickness and poverty was seen as a punishment from God, either for the sins of the parents or for people's own sins, so they were considered unclean. And women in general were considered as inferior to men. They weren't taught the Torah, their witness wasn't accepted in a court of law, and they were basically restricted to the home. The closest thing we would get to it in today's society would be a society which is under strict Sharia law. So, Judaism at the time of Jesus was clearly divided into groups who were considered pleasing and unpleasing to God, clean and unclean, acceptable and unacceptable. Now, the amazing thing about Jesus, who is the revelation of God, is that he counters this original sin, this judgmental mind, this dualistic mind. He gravitates towards the people who are considered unacceptable to God. He gravitates towards this marginalized, oppressed, excluded, hated group. And in fact, on the cross, he becomes one of these groups. He becomes the victim. If you have a look at his teachings, everything he's saying and everything he does is trying to undermine this original sin. For example, his teaching on love of enemies. So he's saying don't have enemies. So when he teaches love of enemies, this totally undermines this. It totally pulls the rug out from under its feet. He's teaching on forgiveness. He's teaching on turning the other cheek. Don't return hatred with hatred. He prays for the forgiveness of the people who are nailing him to the cross. So at his resurrection, there is no talk of revenge. Let's go back and get the guys who did this to me. You cannot use the teaching or the example of Jesus to create divisions in society. He totally undermines the dualistic, judgmental mind. He's trying to create the compassionate mind which draws together rather than pulls apart. So again, basically his teachings cannot be used to justify hatred in any way. I want to have a look at a reading from the 18th chapter of Luke, which talks about some of these points. It's the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. Okay, so the Pharisees were considered the good law-abiding Jews, and the publicans were seen as the sinners. He spoke the following parable to some people who prided themselves on being virtuous and despised everybody else. So there you have it straight away. People who saw themselves as good and looked down, despised everybody else. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood there and said this prayer to himself: I thank you, God, that I am not grasping, unjust, adulterous, like the rest of mankind. So he sees himself as separate from the rest of humanity, as superior, as more righteous than the rest of humanity. And particularly that I'm not like this tax collector here. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes. He gives money to charity. Then the tax collector stood some distance away, not daring even to raise his eyes to heaven. He beat his breast and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. This man, I tell you, went home again at rights with God. The other did not. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the man who humbles himself will be exalted. So he's saying that the Pharisee walks home pleasing to God, whereas the tax collector walks home pleasing to God, whereas the Pharisee does not. Because the Pharisee is not aware of his sin. He's not conscious of his own shadow, and therefore he projects it onto everybody else. He's not aware of his own faults, and therefore he is not aware of his need for mercy. Whereas the tax collector, who is aware of his sin, aware of his faults, aware of his own shadow, is also aware of his need for mercy, and this is what makes him pleasing and acceptable to God. So, basically, to sum up, Jesus on the cross becomes the victim. He becomes the innocent victim of the judgmental, dualistic mind, the mind that divides the world into good and bad. And at the time of Jesus, this mind was being used by religion to divide the world into acceptable and unacceptable. St. Paul says that on the cross he becomes sin. So on the cross we have the symbol of God becoming the victim, God identifying with the victim. And therefore in his body and with his blood he's saying, stop creating innocent victims of hatred and violence. Because when you kill people, you are killing me. When you create victims of violence, it's me who you are killing, whether those victims be innocent Muslim children, innocent Palestinian children, innocent Jewish children, innocent Christian children, whatever. If they're victims of violence and hatred, it's me who you are killing. And ultimately, if it's me you are killing, it's your own soul who you are killing. And this is why history can never be the same after Jesus, because in Jesus we have God identifying with the victim, God identifying with the least in society. Gandhi says you can judge a society by the way it treats the least of its members. Christianity gives the least of its members the ultimate value, because he says what you do to them, you do to me. And that's why after Jesus, history can never be the same again. Thank you for listening.